Okay. Hello, and welcome to today's podcast on how to get your board members engaged by showing up for board meetings and actively participating in those meetings. My name is Regina Hopkins, and I am the Assistant Director of the DC Bar Pro Bono Center. Our mission is to provide pro bono legal services for nonprofit organizations in DC. And joining me today for our podcast is Susan Schaefer, Principal of Resource Partners, LLC. Susan is a consultant, author, and speaker with a wide range of expertise in nonprofit board development and fundraising, and she is a frequent presenter at conferences and classrooms. She also co-authored Nonprofit Board Service for the Genius with Bob Wittig. Susan has also edited many other books for the sector, including the Nonprofit Consulting Playbook. She serves as adjunct faculty at Johns Hopkins University and spends much of her free time serving on nonprofit boards. So welcome, Susan, and thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you so much, Regina, for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. As I mentioned, today's topic is how to get your board members to just show up for board meetings and participating in the meetings themselves. This is a topic that I know from my own experience has perplexed many a nonprofit organization. I'm constantly speaking with nonprofits who have to cope with disengaged boards by either with the result that sometimes they can't even get a quorum of members to show up at a meeting, so they're pretty stymied or stopped in their tracks because they can't even take appropriate board action. So my first question for you is, when is the best time to focus on this issue? And I'm going to guess maybe you're going to say it's when you're actually recruiting your board members.
You read my mind. Recruitment is definitely the key with attendance, as it is with so many other issues related to boards. And I do want to say that I'm thrilled that you're having a podcast related to board attendance because it's such a basic issue, but one that really isn't discussed very much. So yes, it does start with that very first phase of board recruitment. In that phase, I think it really helps to test the reliability of your candidates. And how might you do that? One of the best things that I've found is you make sure that when you hold interviews with candidates that they show up and they show up on time, and ask them for their resume and see how long it takes to receive that resume. There are some really basic things you can do to just get a general check on the reliability of candidates. And I think it's an obvious red flag to me after many years of serving on boards and working with nonprofits to advance their boards, that general test of reliability can so often be a sign of things to come. And I think the second piece of that reliability phase is to set expectations very clearly so that beyond the basics, the submitting things on time and passing all of those initial tests, nonprofit board members often don't know what is expected of them. So it's terrific to be able to set out expectations very clearly from the beginning. It can happen in a more formal way, through written expectations or verbally. I think, frankly, the written form is terrific and allows folks to hold on to a document that allows them to see over time what those commitments are and allows the board, frankly, to monitor them. We can talk in more depth about that later. But, and maybe finally on this topic, it's worth saying that while everyone is often vying for those community members that are involved on so many boards because those seem like the real superstars, you do want to think twice about whether those people might be overcommitted in their roles. So you really want to make sure that you make those expectations explicit, particularly about board attendance. How many meetings will there be? How many meetings do you expect folks to attend? And make sure that they don't have too many commitments so that they can't make those meetings.
The other thing I sometimes, and I have been guilty of it myself when recruiting other board members, is, they seem to be great in the community, but that doesn't mean they have a passion for your mission. How much of that do you think is important to you, that they care about the work of your organization?
Oh, it's huge. I've done whole workshops around the idea that mission really is central to board member excellence. There are so many board members, as we all know, who get pulled onto boards because their friends asked them to join, because they went to an event that seemed fun and engaging, but they really didn't have an underlying passion for the mission. And in the end, that is one of the absolute keys that keep people coming back to meetings. They really have to want to dig in and discuss and grapple with the issues related to this particular organization and its mission. So it's a very fair question in the recruitment stage to be able to ask a potential board member, what is your connection to this mission, and make sure that you feel some real compelling answer from them.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I hear from board members, and it's a little sad when you hear it, is they say, I go to these meetings, but I don't think I'm adding any value to the organization. They either feel that their expertise is not called upon, or they just go and listen to a lot of reports from the staff, and that they're not adding that important element or value. And so, maybe what's the difference if I show up or not? How do you deal with that?
Oh, well, you're getting at one of my other favorite topics, and that is the importance of those meetings themselves. I know that nonprofit staff often spend an enormous amount of time preparing for board meetings. Sometimes it's really worth stepping back and reevaluating the structure of those meetings, the content of the meetings, because let's face it, those meetings really are the bulk of board members' work. A board is a group of people, and we have to utilize that time very well, because that is the time that they spend together. So those meetings need to be efficient and they need to be meaningful. So how do you get board members to feel like their time is being well used at those meetings? I think the number one point, and one that's so easily overlooked by all of us, is to just be respectful of everyone's time at those meetings. If you want to attract high-value board members, they do have a lot going on, and I think you can do very little more easily and to impress more your board members than to start the meeting on time, to end it on time. And if that is perpetually a problem, you might do the simple thing of creating some time frames within the board agenda so that each item has a designated amount of time next to it. And then you really need a board chair who's going to stick to those time frames. And if the board goes over on one of those topics and you go outside of your time frame, you've got to find a way to shave it back. Board members are very happy when the board meetings themselves are respectful of their time. And then secondly, you really do have to make those meetings meaningful. That means ensuring that most of the agenda focuses on items that require board decisions and not board information. I mean, really, again, we could do a whole podcast just about how to get board members to read those board packets so that we are not spending those couple of hours regurgitating information that was in the board packets. But for now, suffice it to say, there are strategies to get board members to read, and they do work. Like anything else, it's a culture change. And by moving in that direction toward getting board members to read, you're opening up time at the meeting so that groups are not reporting out. You're not hearing about committee reports. You are really discussing substantive issues. And if the bulk of the meeting on the agenda is devoted to one or two substantive issues, then your board members will feel like, yes, my professional opinion, my personal experiences, whatever it is that ties into the board mission and the organizational needs are really of value.
You talked about the culture of the board, and creating a culture like of showing up on time and showing up prepared. I guess that really starts with the chair, and it sort of flows from that. What are some of the things that you can do to help create that culture?
Yes, culture is it's such an important piece of this, and it seems so touchy-feely that a lot of people kind of pass it by, but I would say that the meetings themselves, as we just discussed, they can be the best draw. People really like an exciting meeting, and I know that can seem like a paradoxical phrase, but I mean, number one, I think a little food and a little fun does not hurt. You want to make these meetings something that is a little bit casual, that allows board members to get to know each other and network. Let's face it, that's another reason that board members might want to show up and attend. It's also worth saying that if the meetings are dull, if you've got, let's say, a group of folks who come in tired after a long day, maybe they're just a group of introverts and you don't get a lot of people who are ready to really just make the most of the experience. I mean, I put myself in that category too, and I feel like sometimes it really helps to have some brief icebreakers during the meeting, or a little time for people, a little extra time during some of the agenda items for folks to share stories, particularly stories related to the mission, and sometimes even mission-oriented experiences help attract people to meetings. Because, you know, to go back to your earlier point about mission, it's really important to continuously reconnect board members with the mission. So, for instance, there is a group I know that annually holds its board meetings on the stage where its dancers perform throughout the year, and they will occasionally have those dancers come through and even lead the board members through a few steps. And look, that might seem very out of the box, but it certainly generates interest from board members, gets them closer to the mission, allows them to ask questions of some of the dancers involved, and it really helps to take a step back and think about how you can inject your mission into the meetings. It just takes the whole meeting to another level. And, you know, to your earlier question about how do you create that culture that encourages people to attend, you want to pique their curiosity, you want to get them involved, and these pieces of making the meeting interesting, deep, exciting, these are all ways to get people to feel like, gee, I do not want to miss this. Last time the board meeting was just very insightful, and it works very well. And I'll add as a footnote, I think also a little bit of peer pressure works wonders. And I don't mean that in any sort of negative way, but many boards that get good attendance, they list the meeting attendees and the no-shows on meeting minutes. And because everyone sees those names, I think that little bit of recognition, both positive and negative, makes people feel like, gee, I don't want to be on that list of no-shows, or certainly not very often. And you know, I think that using those kinds of tactics can really help folks commit to a presence and make sure that they are doing what the rest of the group wants them to do. Sometimes that peer pressure can be very positive.
Mm-hmm. One of the things, like sometimes when I counsel boards, I find that, you know, they've done all the right things, they've picked the right people, they're trying to come up with an engaged board meetings and all that, but there's one, maybe two board members that are really difficult personalities. They can be disruptive, really argumentative, they get mad, you know, and it just makes a bad experience for everybody in the meetings, and that tends to drive away some of the good board members who are in demand, as we were talking about. So, you know, how do you deal with those difficult board members who are just sort of, you know, putting a spanner in the works, if you will, for your board meetings?
Oh, I hear you, and I think we've all sat on boards or worked with boards that had at least one person like that. One of the first boards that I served on had someone who was a terrific community activist, and this was at the phase where the board was really changing from a founding board to a board of the larger community. And this this person was very active in the community and would come to the meetings and was so passionate that she would stand up and lean across the table and at a very high pitch and high volume argue very loudly for points that she believed in. And boy, her passion certainly came through, but it made for a very awkward and disruptive meeting. So that was an early indoctrination to me into what this kind of disruptive board member or board behavior can do. A couple of things that I've found work particularly well over the years, and the obvious one is that ideally the board chair will facilitate something like that in the moment and ask that person to, have that person state his or her case in a respectful way, and then certainly talk to that board member offline and reiterate the expectations. This is where I think a board commitment form, I alluded to that earlier when we talked about recruitment, a board commitment form can work wonders. Many organizations have a board commitment form, but it's not used to the full extent. If you're not familiar with a board commitment form, or those in your audience are not, it really is, it doesn't have to be a long document, but it's a list really of what is expected of board members. It begins with things like attendance, the number of meetings that are expected to be attended each year, but it can also go into behaviors. So the fact that we will all treat each other in a respectful way where we hear each other out and respond to each other respectfully, I think it can get to all of those pieces and more. If your organization is looking for a good start to a board commitment form that you can customize, you can feel free to pull down the one that we've got at nonprofitboardgenius.com. And if you utilize a board commitment form, it's not enough to just have board members sign it every year, as many organizations do. A lot of organizations say, we want you to recommit to the board commitment form, and they'll have board members sign it. But it really takes having a committee, which can go by many names, but it's most often called a governance committee. And that is a group that oversees the board's good operations. And if the board commitment form cites things like respectful behavior, look, that should seem obvious to anyone serving on a board, but if we've got it in writing and we sign that form every year, it makes it so much easier for a committee on trustees or a governance committee or whatever you want to call it to pull aside a board member and say, look, we really need you to adhere to this behavior that you have committed to already in writing. Mm-hmm. And I think that can be very helpful for the conversations, both for the board chair and for that governance committee. Those forms, when well written and tailored to a particular board, can really be lifesavers in terms of making the conversation a little bit less awkward because you've got a document there.
The other thing I always, sometimes no matter what you do and no matter how much you've screened the board members, you do get people who, for whatever reason, sometimes their life circumstances change, or they just thought they had more time than they did, or whatever. They just don't show up. And I always tell my clients that, they cannot, every board member has a fiduciary duty to carry out their duties to certain standards of care. And if you're not showing up, there's no way you can claim reasonably that you are meeting your fiduciary duties. And so they have to, they're just not doing it. But the other thing is, and I've seen this with nonprofits where they can't even get a quorum, like I said before, because they have a real absentee problem. And at that point, when if someone's not showing up and it impairs the organization, it's not just that person's problem, it's the whole board's problem, because they have a fiduciary duty to sort of deal with the fact that they have absenteeism on their board. And it may mean having to, let's face it, vote someone off. But that is, I find, very difficult. The boards realize it's a problem. They realize that oftentimes they can't function the way they need to because they can't even get together a good meeting. but it's very hard for them to have those conversations with the wayward board members, and or even amongst themselves. So how do you work with the board to get them to sort of, address these, what are, personality issues oftentimes, in a way that is helpful for the organization?
Oh, you're right. We are so nice in this sector, aren't we? It's so difficult to get rid of board members. It's so true. Without disrupting that nice culture too much, it is true that sometimes you really do need to address these issues head on. And again, I really find that more than anything else, those board commitment forms can serve as a very powerful tool to leverage the fact that this board member has, this disruptive board member, let's say, or this absentee board member, or fill in the blank, is going against the prescribed behaviors that he or she has agreed to. So when you've got that kind of board member, it really helps the conversations. But in general, I think it's important to remember that absentee board members often, they might have lost interest after, let's say, many years on the board. They may just no longer have time for, or they otherwise can no longer commit to serving. And rather than being candid about those particular things, for whatever reason, they stop showing up. And maybe their intention is to show up and they don't. So, I think it's first important to assume that their intentions are good and that they're simply overcommitted, or there's something else going on in their lives. And when that happens, I think it's very imperative that you don't let it go on too long, because this is where the culture can turn for the negative when one board member stops showing up regularly, and then others see that happening and say, well, if I can still maintain the perks of serving on this board without coming to meetings, why not? I'll do it too. So the board chair, ideally, and again, the backup can be the chair of the governance committee, but it should be the chair, can simply sit down and check in, and the chair can acknowledge simply that they've seen a drop in attendance and wonder whether the board member would prefer to serve in a different role. If the board chair feels very strongly that that person should serve in a different role, it can certainly be couched in a firmer manner. And in any case, most of the time, the perpetrating board member, the absentee board member, is so relieved to have this kind of conversation. It's easy to assume that those board members don't have good intentions, but usually it's just something awkward that neither side wants to bring up, and just by raising the issue, it either gets a board member very re-engaged because they realize that they've been way off track, but more often it's an opportunity for that board member to say, look, I'll be honest, I am way overcommitted, or I do have something going on in my personal life, or look, this really is I've just been on the board too long and need to get off, and it's been difficult for me. So usually those conversations let the absentee board member off the hook quite easily and nicely. And importantly, assuming this is someone who has served in a board role for some amount of time, the board chair can help figure out a new role for that person. Maybe it's just on a committee of the board, if your bylaws allow for that. Maybe it's someone who will just help with the event once a year because that's that board member's favorite piece of the work. At any rate, I think those kinds of conversations really help. And then certainly if the board chair needs to take a hard line and so-called fire the board member, sometimes it does certainly come to that. But I'd say the vast majority of the time, these kind of civil, respecting conversations can just do a world of good, because you can bring on a new board member who's got new energy and more time, and you also don't lose someone who may have at some point been a very valuable and still may be a very committed donor, supporter, volunteer, fill in the blank. So often everyone goes away happy.
I was going to say, the other, you mentioned putting stuff in writing. Sometimes you'll see in bylaws that if someone misses so many meetings in the course of 12 months or something like that, they're automatically removed from the board. Sort of, some people feel that's a little rigid, but it does have the advantage of saying it's not me, it's the bylaws, and it sort of takes the onus off everybody for having to make the difficult decision. It's made by operation of bylaws.
That's correct. Correct. And even if your bylaws don't include that, you can include something similar in that board commitment form where you say board members are expected to attend 8 of 10 meetings a year or whatever the number is, and it does allow them to open up the conversation around, well, you haven't done that, you've only been here for 5 meetings, and so therefore we really need to have a serious conversation about your future with this board.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Susan, for your insights. It sounds like the takeaway is the first step is picking the right people in the first place. The second is having engaging and interesting board meetings where you create an expectation that people show up on time and prepared, and then if you have people who aren't able for one reason or another to satisfy the commitment, that you address it in a timely manner. It sounds so easy.
I know it's always much more complex than it seems, but it is important to say, as you alluded to, Regina, at the beginning, it is so important to have not only a quorum, but really a full participation, because this is important. The board is only as good as its meetings, since those are the times when members can deliberate and make decisions. So don't be afraid to take a stand on this issue. Be a champion of having good board attendance, and these steps, most of them are quite simple to put into place.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Susan, and thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you.